There is a city in southern Italy where the streets have risen 140 centimeters since 2005, not 140 centimeters gradually over geological time. A meter and 40 centimeters in 20 years, enough to leave the waterfront railings of Pozzuoli's harbor visibly higher than they were a generation ago. In February 2026, the ground beneath this city shook 70 times in a single week. In March 2025, an earthquake of magnitude 4.6 rattled windows across the Naples metropolitan area, the largest the system had produced in the entire 20-year cycle. Italy declared a national emergency. The red telephone at the Osservatorio Vesuviano in Naples, which connects directly to Civil Protection headquarters in Rome, is tested twice a day. The city is Pozzuoli. It sits inside Campi Flegrei, a 12 by 15 kilometer volcanic caldera that is not a mountain, not a cone, not a geyser field. It is a depression in the earth, partially submerged beneath the Bay of Pozzuoli and partially covered by streets, apartment buildings, schools, and the harbor where 80,000 people live their daily lives on ground that has been technically part of a volcanic caldera since before recorded history. In April 2026, a research team published a study on arXiv that has been circulating through volcanology circles ever since. Their finding: the acceleration of seismic and deformation activity at Campi Flegrei is not following an exponential growth curve. It is following what mathematicians call a finite time singularity, a pattern in which the rate of acceleration itself is growing, and their independent models converge on a specific window, 2030 to 2034. 500,000 people live inside the caldera. 3 million more live within pyroclastic flow range of it. The last time this system erupted, a mountain 133 meters tall grew from flat ground in 8 days. To understand what is happening at Campi Flegrei right now, you need to understand what the system actually is, and what it has done before. The Campi Flegrei caldera was not created by a single eruption, it was created by two. The first, approximately 39,000 years ago, is called the Campanian ignimbrite event. Scientists estimate it ejected roughly 72 cubic miles of material. Ash from that eruption has been found across Europe and into Russia. Global temperatures dropped. The entire continent of Europe, as far as the Ural Mountains, was blanketed in volcanic debris. Some researchers have proposed that this single event may have contributed to the collapse of the Neanderthal population in Europe, though that link remains debated. The second caldera-forming eruption, the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff, occurred approximately 15,000 years ago and deposited the pale stone from which the historic center of Naples itself was built. The city literally constructed itself from the remains of the volcano beneath it. The name, Campi Flegrei or Phlegrean Fields, comes from the Greek word phlegra, meaning to burn. Ancient Romans identified this landscape as the entrance to the underworld. Lake Avernus, one of the caldera's crater lakes, was where Aeneas descended to Hades in the Aeneid. The fumaroles, the boiling mud pots, the ground that hisses and steams. These were not unusual sights to the people of the ancient world. They were features of the landscape. They built temples here. They built markets. They built a harbor. And then, on September 29, 1538, the caldera produced its most recent eruption. What happened in 1538 was not a gentle event. A new vent opened near the town of Pozzuoli. Over the following 8 days, the eruption built an entirely new mountain, 133 meters tall, now called Monte Nuovo, from what had been flat ground. On the final day of the eruption, a group of people who had climbed the new cone to observe it were killed when the crater exploded without warning beneath them. Before that eruption, the last volcanic activity at Campi Flegrei had been approximately 3,000 years earlier. The system had been quiet for 3 millennia, and then it was not. After 1538, the caldera returned to the patterns of what geologists call bradyseism, from the Greek for slow earthquake, the gradual rising and falling of the caldera floor driven by the hydrothermal and magmatic system beneath. For centuries, the ground moved, but nothing erupted. Pozzuoli's ancient harbor provides a geological record of this movement that is visible to anyone who visits. The Roman columns of the Old Market, the Macellum of Pozzuoli, bear the marks of marine boring organisms at heights far above the current sea level. By the year 1000, the caldera floor had sunk so far that the market was 11 meters below the sea. By 1538, the year Monte Nuovo appeared, it had risen 12 meters. The columns still stand, the borings are still visible, a geological textbook encoded in stone on the Pozzuoli waterfront. The modern era of unrest began in 1950, with a small episode of uplift and seismicity that subsided. It returned in 1969 to 1972. when the ground rose significantly enough that 40,000 residents of Pozzuoli were evacuated. It returned again in 1982 to 1984, more intense than the first modern episode, and again forcing evacuations. Both episodes ended without an eruption. Both times the population returned. And then, in 2005, the current episode began. It has not stopped. That is the critical detail that the new research is focused on. The current unrest cycle has not subsided the way the previous episodes did. It has continued, and it has accelerated. The arXiv paper published in April 2026 by Zaccagnino, Sornet, Zaccagnino, and Picozzi introduces a specific mathematical claim about the nature of that acceleration. In previous assessments of Campi Flegrei's unrest, the growth of seismicity and deformation was modeled as exponential. Exponential growth is alarming but predictable in a certain sense. It grows by a constant factor over time. What the 2026 paper argues is that the behavior at Campi Flegrei is no longer well described by exponential growth. It is described by a finite time singularity, a curve in which the growth rate itself is increasing. The system is not just accelerating, it is accelerating faster over time. And finite time singularities, by mathematical definition, do not continue forever. They converge on a critical point. The paper's independent analyses place that critical point at approximately 2030 to 2034. By that time, if the current trajectory holds, the total ground uplift at the point of maximum deformation is projected to reach approximately 4 meters. The current total, recorded at the INGV monitoring station RITE in November 2024, was 1.33 meters. That means the system may produce as much additional uplift in the next 8 years as it has in the previous 20. To understand why that matters, consider how Campi Flegrei's crust actually responds to the pressure building beneath it. Deep below the surface, a magmatic body is releasing gases, primarily water vapor, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. Those gases migrate upward through the crust, heating the water in the hydrothermal reservoir above the magma. As the reservoir heats and pressurizes, it pushes upward on the caldera floor, producing the bradycism, the ground uplift. The crust above acts like a lid. When the pressure becomes sufficient, the lid fractures, producing the seismic swarms that rattle Pozzuoli's windows. The fractures allow some pressure to escape. But here is the mechanism that makes Campi Flegrei's current situation qualitatively different from the previous episodes. The lid does not fully recover. Each swarm fractures the crust a little more than the last one. Each episode leaves the rock slightly weaker, slightly more susceptible to the next pressure pulse. Christopher Kilburn, a volcanologist at University College London who has studied Campi Flegrei for decades, described the compounding effect precisely. At each emergency, he said, the crust is being stretched just that bit further, so the later emergencies are building on the previous ones. Imagine a pressure cooker with a lid that keeps resealing after each burst. The lid doesn't break in the same way each time. It reseals, but the material is slightly damaged. The heat source underneath has not been reduced. Pressure builds again. The lid reseals again. But each cycle it is a little thinner, a little more compromised, and the next burst arrives a little sooner. The 2026 arXiv paper is saying that we are in the later stages of that process, and the trajectory of the damage to the lid is curving toward a point where the next burst may not be followed by a reseal. What that critical mechanical threshold produces is not something scientists are predicting with certainty. There are multiple possible outcomes. The most likely is not a full-scale magmatic eruption of the kind that formed the caldera. What the 2026 research and the 2025 science study describe as more probable in the near to medium term are phreatic explosions, steam-driven blasts, triggered by the sudden flashing of superheated water to steam when a pressure boundary fails, or significant structural failure of the caldera crust producing seismic damage across a densely populated area. Those events can be catastrophic without involving lava. The geochemical record is adding a piece of evidence that makes scientists particularly attentive. The ratio of hydrogen sulfide to carbon dioxide measured at the Solfatara fumaroles has been increasing. That shift indicates that the gases are coming from progressively deeper in the system, from magma that has not yet released its volatiles. The deep driver is becoming more involved in the process, even as the surface manifestations remain non-eruptive. The system is not detached from its magmatic source. It is being increasingly driven by it. For the 500,000 people inside the caldera, and the 3 million in the surrounding metropolitan area, this is the context within which Italian civil protection operates today. Italy's evacuation plan covers the red zone, approximately 500,000 residents across 25 municipalities, and depends on days to weeks of precursory warning to execute. The plan was developed based on the assumption that a large eruption would be preceded by a significant period of escalating unrest. That assumption may hold. But the phreatic explosion scenario, the sudden, near-surface, steam-driven blast with little or no advance warning, is precisely the kind of event for which the plan was not designed. The Solfatara crater in the heart of the caldera was closed to tourists in 2017 after a family fell through the thin crust overlying the hydrothermal system below. The crust in active areas of Campi Flegrei is not a metaphor, it is a physical measurement. In some places, it is under a meter thick. There are 3 signals that INGV and international monitoring teams are tracking as the system moves through 2026 and toward the critical window the 2026 paper identifies. The first is the uplift rate itself. Currently at approximately 10 millimeters per month, any sustained increase in that rate would indicate the self-reinforcing cycle is intensifying on a shorter timescale than the models currently project. The difference between 10 millimeters per month and 15 millimeters per month may sound minor. In a finite time singularity curve, it is not. The second is the H2S/CO2 ratio at the Solfatara Picciarelli fumarole field. As long as that ratio continues to shift toward hydrogen sulfide, deeper magmatic gases, the evidence for increasing deep involvement grows. A stabilization of that ratio would be a meaningful, though not definitive, sign that the system is pausing its deepening involvement. The third is the next earthquake above magnitude 4.5. The current cycle's maximum recorded magnitudes have been stepping upward. 4.4 in March 2025, 4.6 in June 2025. Each new maximum above the previous record means the crust has fractured along a new plane that had not fractured before. It means the damage to the lid is extending. The next M4.5 or above is not just a data point. It is a measurement of how much further the system has progressed toward the threshold. The 2033 window is not a deadline. It is a projected convergence point derived from the current mathematical behavior of the system. It could arrive earlier if the acceleration intensifies. It could shift later if the system pauses, as it has paused briefly in previous episodes. But the 4 previous unrest episodes, 1950, 1969, 1982, and 2005, have each been more intense than the last. The current episode is the longest, the most extensive in total uplift, and the only one in which maximum earthquake magnitudes have stepped above 4.4. It is also the only one whose acceleration pattern, according to the 2026 research, does not resemble exponential growth. It resembles something that ends at a point. For the people of Pozzuoli, who can see fumaroles from their windows, feel the small earthquakes in their walls, and walk the waterfront where Roman columns still bear the marks of a sea that once stood above their heads, the question of what the caldera will do next is not abstract. It is the background condition of daily life in one of the most geological consequential locations on Earth. Subscribe to stay ahead of what's coming.